The air in the obsidian palace tasted of ozone and ancient metallic blood. Lightning fractured the sky above the spire, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floors of the forbidden wing, shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Celestia Dawn pressed herself into the velvet alcove, her breath hitched in a throat dry with terror. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one was. But the footsteps approaching were not the rhythmic march of the guards. They were heavy, uneven, and feral. A low growl vibrated through the stone walls, a sound that triggered a primal instinct in every cell of her body to flee, yet she was frozen. The door to the chamber blew open, not by wind, but by sheer force of will. Standing there, silhouetted against the storm, was Lucius Nightshade, the tyrant, the alpha of alphas, and his eyes were burning with a violet madness that promised death, or something far worse. Celestia Dawn was invisible. In the grand hierarchy of the wolf kingdoms, she was lower than the peasantry. She was a dust walker, an omega without a lineage, without a pack, and seemingly without a sliver of magic. Her existence was defined by the gray rags she wore and the scrub brush she wielded. The Obsidian Palace was a monument to the Nightshade dynasty's brutality. Walls of black stone rose high into the cloud line, and the corridors were perpetually cold, chilled by the dark magic that radiated from the throne room. For 3 years, Celestia had scrubbed these floors, keeping her head down, her scent masked by the harsh lye soap and the dust of 1,000 years. To look a noble in the eye was a crime. To look at the king was a death sentence. "Igekar, hurry up, girl!" hissed Mara, the head housekeeper, snapping her fingers near Celestia's ear. "The solstice ball is in 2 days. The king demands the east wing be spotless. If he finds a single speck of dust, it won't be me facing the executioner." Celestia nodded, clutching her bucket. "Yes, Mistress Mara." "And stay out of the royal quarters," Mara added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though her eyes gleamed with fear. "He's unwell. The curse is active. The guards say he tore the iron gates off the training grounds this morning with his bare hands." The curse. Everyone whispered about it, but no one knew the truth. Legend said the Nightshade bloodline was poisoned by the void, a dark magic that gave them immense power, but slowly devoured their sanity. They became beasts, creatures of pure instinct and violence, unless they found an anchor. But Lucius Nightshade, at 28, had no queen, no mate, and no anchor. He ruled alone, a terrifying deity of shadow and strength. Celestia moved to the east wing, her small frame straining under the weight of the water bucket. She was an anomaly among omegas. Usually, omegas were cherished for their calming pheromones, protected and pampered, but Celestia was a null. She produced no scent, or at least none that anyone could detect. It made her worthless for breeding or status, but perfect for a maid. She could move through the palace like a ghost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, a strange heaviness settled over the palace. The magical wards hummed, a low, painful frequency that made Celestia's teeth ache. She was scrubbing the baseboards near the entrance to the royal library when the alarms didn't sound. That was the first sign of danger. Usually, when the king was on a rampage, bells tolled to warn the servants to hide. Today, there was only silence, a suffocating, unnatural silence. Celestia stood up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. She sensed it before she heard it, a shift in the air pressure, like the drop before a thunderstorm. The torches in the hallway flickered and died, one by one, plunging the corridor into darkness. "Run," her instincts screamed. "Hide." But the corridor was long, and the only unlocked door was the one she had been warned never to enter. The king's private study within the forbidden wing. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. She could hear the footsteps now. Thud, drag, thud. It sounded like a wounded beast dragging a carcass. The smell hit her next, not the lye soap she was used to, but something rich and overwhelming. Burning pine, rain on hot asphalt, and the copper tang of fresh blood. It was the king's scent, and it was uncontrolled, flooding the hallway in choking waves. Celestia scrambled backward, her hand fumbling for the brass handle of the study door. It turned. She slipped inside, closing it softly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed her ear to the wood, praying he would pass by. She was wrong. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The heavy oak door didn't just open, it disintegrated. Splinters of wood exploded inward as a wave of dark violet energy blasted the hinges apart. Celestia was thrown backward, landing hard on the plush Persian rug. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, scrambling to push herself up, but the pressure in the room had increased tenfold. It was like gravity had shifted, pinning her to the floor. Lucius Nightshade stood in the ruin of the doorway. He was larger than the statues in the great hall. His shirt was torn to shreds, revealing a torso sculpted from marble and scarred by battles both physical and magical. Blood, dark and viscous, dripped from a wound on his shoulder, but he didn't seem to notice it. His skin was glowing faintly with violet veins, the void magic trying to break through his physical form. But it was his face that froze Celestia's blood. It was a mask of agony and predatory hunger. His jaw was clenched tight enough to snap bone, and his eyes, they were entirely black, save for a rim of glowing electric violet iris. Who? His voice was a grinding of stones, barely human. Who is there? Celestia trembled, pressing her forehead into the rug. No one, Your Majesty, just dust. I am just dust. She tried to make herself small, to disappear as she always did. But for the first time in her life, her invisibility failed. Lucius took a step forward, staggering. He clutched his chest, his claws digging into his own skin. The magic was consuming him. The blood moon fever, a critical accumulation of alpha energy that demanded release, usually through violence or intense intimacy. Without a mate to ground the energy, it would burn him alive from the inside out. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. The beast within him paused. You. He turned his gaze toward her. To Celestia's horror, the blackness in his eyes receded slightly, revealing a flash of golden humanity. He looked confused. You don't smell like fear. You smell like silence. He lurched toward her. Celestia scrambled back until her spine hit the mahogany desk. There was nowhere to go. Please, Your Majesty, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. I'll leave. I didn't mean to. Quiet! The roar shook the glass in the windows. Lucius fell to his knees in front of her, the movement ungraceful and desperate. He was losing the battle. The shadows in the room were lengthening, turning into claws that scraped at the walls. He reached out, his hand massive and trembling, and gripped Celestia's ankle. His skin was burning hot. It hurts, he rasped, the monster gone for a fleeting second, replaced by a dying man. The noise, the chaos, make it stop. Celestia looked down at him. She should kick him. She should run. This was the tyrant who had executed the northern rebels without a trial. But looking at him now, seeing the sweat beading on his brow and the veins pulsing dangerously at his neck, she felt a strange, inexplicable tug in her chest. A tether she didn't know existed, pulled taut. She didn't move away. Lucius dragged himself closer, his vision blurring. The Omega before him was small, frail, wrapped in rags. She should have been repulsive to his heightened senses, which usually craved power and status, but she was the only thing in the room that wasn't screaming. Her presence was a pool of cool water in a burning house. He pulled himself up, hovering over her, trapping her against the desk. His breathing was ragged, hot against her neck. The proximity was intoxicating. The curse demanded he take, it demanded he claim. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The heat radiating off him was enough to blister, but Celestia shivered, a jolt of electricity arcing down her spine. I need, he groaned, his forehead dropping to rest on her shoulder. He was heavy, impossibly heavy. I need to make love, to break the fever. Celestia stopped breathing. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication and danger. He pulled back slightly, his violet eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't seeing a servant anymore. He was seeing a lifeline. His hand moved up her arm, his grip bruising yet strangely careful. Don't move, he whispered, the command carrying the weight of the crown and the curse. Celestia squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the violation, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, Lucius buried his face in the crook of her neck and inhaled. He didn't kiss her. He didn't tear her clothes. He simply breathed her in. And as he did, a shockwave blasted through the room, not of destruction, but of light. A golden light erupted from where their skin touched. The shadows on the walls shrieked and vanished. The oppressive weight in the room lifted. Lucius gasped, his body going rigid, as the chaotic void magic was sucked out of his system, neutralized by the contact with her skin. He wasn't taking her body. He was drinking her soul's calm. For Celestia, the sensation was overwhelming. It felt like being hooked up to a lightning storm. She gasped, arching her back, her hands instinctively grabbing his biceps to steady herself. She wasn't just a null. She was a conduit. For a timeless minute, they stayed like that, the Alpha King kneeling before the Dustwalker, clinging to her as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. Then, as quickly as it began, the energy settled. Lucius slumped forward, unconscious, his head resting in her lap. The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. Celestia sat frozen, her legs numb, the weight of the unconscious king pressing her into the rug. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What just happened? She looked down at Lucius. In sleep, the harsh lines of cruelty were smoothed from his face. He looked younger, burdened. And there was something else. A mark on his neck, right where the pulse jumped, was glowing softly. A golden insignia. She looked at her own wrist. The same mark, a stylized sun breaking through a crescent moon, was etched into her skin in shimmering gold light. She rubbed it frantically. It wouldn't come off. A soul bond. The realization made her nauseous. Soul bonds were myths, fairy tales told to pups to make them believe in destiny. They didn't happen in real life, and they certainly didn't happen between a king and a cleaning maid. If anyone saw this mark, she would be accused of bewitching him. She would be burned at the stake. "I have to go," she whispered to the empty room. She tried to shift Lucius off her. He groaned, his arm tightening reflexively around her waist, even in sleep. "No," he mumbled, a slur of words. "Stay. The light." "I can't," she sobbed softly. With a surge of adrenaline, she pried his fingers loose. It felt like tearing off her own skin. The physical separation caused a physical ache in her chest, a phantom pain. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling toward the shattered door. She looked back once. Lucius lay on the rug, peaceful for the first time in years, the violet madness gone from his aura. She ran. She ran through the forbidden wing, down the spiral stairs and into the labyrinth of the servants' quarters. She didn't stop until she reached the tiny, damp closet she called a room. She slammed the door and collapsed on her straw mattress, pulling her thin blanket over her head. She scrubbed her wrist with rough wool until it bled, but the golden mark remained, pulsing with a faint, warm rhythm. It beat in time with a heart that was not her own. She could feel him. She could feel Lucius sleeping 2 floors above her. The next morning, the palace was in an uproar. "The king is cured!" The whisper traveled through the laundry lines and the scullery like wildfire. Mara, the head housekeeper, was bustling about with frantic energy. "Get up, Dawn!" Mara barked, kicking Celestia's door open. "Stop lazing about. The king has awoken with clear eyes. He demands a grand assembly. Everyone to the great hall. Now!" Celestia wrapped a bandage around her wrist, hiding the mark. The servants too?" "Everyone," Mara said, eyeing Celestia suspiciously. "You look pale, girl, and you smell different." Celestia froze. "Different?" "Like ozone," Mara sniffed, "and expensive pine." Celestia's blood ran cold. The king's scent was clinging to her. She hadn't washed. I was scrubbing the armory," Celestia lied quickly. "Must be the polish." Mara narrowed her eyes but didn't press. "Move. The king is looking for someone. He says an assassin broke into his room last night, bewitched him, and fled. He's going to inspect every soul in this castle until he finds them." Celestia felt the floor tilt beneath her. He didn't remember the bond. Or worse, he remembered it, and he viewed it as an attack. She was herded into the great hall, along with 300 other servants. The room was cavernous, filled with nobles in silks and velvets, all whispering behind their fans. At the far end, upon the obsidian throne, sat Lucius. He looked magnificent and terrifying. His wounds were healed, his power was controlled, radiating off him in confident waves rather than chaotic bursts. But his eyes were scanning the crowd with the precision of a hawk hunting a field mouse. Beside him stood Lady Vespera, the daughter of the Southern Duke. She was tall, voluptuous, and cruel, everything a queen should be. She had her hand on Lucius's arm, whispering in his ear. Lucius ignored her. He stood up and the hall went silent. "Last night," his voice boomed, amplified by magic, "my affliction was stabilized by an intruder." The crowd gasped. This person possesses a rare magic, Lucius continued, descending the steps of the dais. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. They left something behind, a trace. He raised his hand. The air in the room shimmered. Celestia huddled in the back row, behind the cooks. Her wrist was burning. The bandage felt like it was on fire. "Don't look at me," she prayed to the ancestors she never knew. "Please, don't look at me." Lucius walked through the rows of trembling servants. He stopped here and there, sniffing the air, dismissing them with a wave. He was getting closer. Suddenly, Lady Vespera stepped forward. "My king, surely it was a noble assassin. Why soil yourself among the rats?" "Because," Lucius said, not taking his eyes off the back of the room, "the scent I'm looking for isn't perfume. It's rain. It's purity." He stopped 10 feet from Celestia. He went still. His head tilted. Celestia held her breath until her lungs burned. The bond in her chest pulled tight like a fishing line reeling her in. Lucius turned slowly. His gaze bypassed the guards, the nobles, the head servants, and landed squarely on the small, trembling figure in the gray rags at the very back. His eyes widened. The gold in his irises flared. "You!" he whispered. He didn't look angry. He looked hungry. "Come here," he commanded. Celestia couldn't move. Her legs were stone. "Guard!" Lucius snapped. "Bring her!" 2 massive armored guards grabbed Celestia by the arms and dragged her forward. She stumbled, falling to her knees at the king's feet. The bandage on her wrist loosened, the edge of the golden glow peeking through. Lady Vespera laughed, a shrill cutting sound. "A dustwalker? You think a scullery maid cured the void curse? Oh, Lucius, the fever must have addled your wits." Lucius didn't look at Vespera. He knelt down, just as he had the night before, ignoring the gasps of the court. He reached out and took Celestia's hand. "Remove the bandage," he ordered softly. Celestia shook her head, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "Please, sire, I'm nobody. Just let me go." I said, "Remove it." With trembling fingers, she unwound the cloth. The golden sun and moon mark blazed into life, bright enough to cast shadows in the hall. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Lucius stared at the mark, then at her. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, a smile that promised the world to her and destruction to anyone who stood in their way. "You aren't nobody," Lucius murmured, pulling her to her feet and pulling her flush against his chest, staining his royal velvet with the dust on her rags. "You are my cure." He turned to the court, his arm clamped around her waist like an iron band. "The search for a queen is over," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "The wedding will be at the next full moon." Celestia looked up at him in horror. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a trap. She saw the murderous rage in Lady Vespera's eyes. She saw the calculating looks of the advisors. Lucius leaned down, his lips grazing her ear, echoing the night before. "Don't move," he whispered, but this time there was a dark amusement in his tone. "Because now that I've found you, I'm never letting you go." The transition from the scullery to the spire was violent in its suddenness. Celestia didn't walk out of the great hall. She was carried. Lucius Nightshade, ignoring the whispers of his court and the frantic advice of his counselors, swept her up into his arms and marched straight to the royal wing, a place where no servant had ever set foot without a bucket in hand. He kicked open the double doors to a suite that was larger than the entire servants' dormitory. It smelled of lavender and old magic. "Put me down!" Celestia finally found her voice, pounding her small fists against his chest. It was like hitting a stone wall. Lucius stopped in the center of the room and set her down, but he didn't step back. He loomed over her, his presence a physical weight. The golden bond on their wrists pulsed in sync. Thump, 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 a heartbeat shared between 2 strangers. "You will stay here," Lucius commanded, his voice raspy. The golden light in his eyes was dimmer now, the violet creeping back at the edges. Being near her soothed him, but the bond was new, unstable. "My guards will stand outside. You are not to leave this room without me." Celestia backed away until her legs hit a velvet chaise. "You can't just keep me like a pet. I have a life. I have work." Lucius let out a dark, humorless laugh. "Work? Scrubbing floors? I'm offering you a crown, Celestia. I'm offering you the world." "I don't want the world," she cried, fear making her bold. "I want to be invisible again, Look at me, Lucius. I am a dustwalker. The court will eat me alive. Lady Vespera looked ready to slit my throat right there in the hall. At the mention of Vespera's name, the temperature in the room dropped. Lucius stepped forward, crowding Celestia until she fell back onto the chaise. He placed a hand on either side of her head, trapping her. "Let them try," he growled, baring his teeth. His canines were slightly elongated, sharp and white. "You're not just a maid anymore. You are the anchor. Do you understand what that means?" He grabbed her hand, forcing her palm against his chest, directly over his heart. Beneath the hard muscle in the silk shirt, she could feel it, a chaotic, thrumming vibration, like a caged storm trying to break the ribs. "Without you," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers, "the void takes me. It eats my mind. It turns me into a beast that knows only slaughter. Yesterday, I was moments away from tearing the palace down, stone by stone. You stopped it." Celestia trembled. The vibration under her hand was terrifying, but his vulnerability was worse. It made him human. "So I am your medicine," she said quietly. "You are my survival," he corrected, "and I am yours, because if I fall, the kingdom falls, and everyone you know, every servant, every friend, will burn in the chaos." He pulled back, his face masking over with royal indifference, though his eyes lingered on her lips. "Maids will come to bathe and dress you. Burn those rags. If you smell like lye soap again, I will have the laundry master executed." "Lucius, do not test me, little mouse. I am a desperate man." He turned and stormed out, the heavy doors slamming shut and locking with a magical click. Celestia was alone in a room full of silk and gold, trapped in the most beautiful prison in the world. 3 days passed, 3 days of being scrubbed, oiled, perfumed, and dressed in gowns that cost more than Celestia would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. She saw Lucius only in the evenings. He would come to her chambers, looking exhausted, the violet veins pulsing on his neck. He would sit beside her, hold her hand, or sometimes just rest his head on her lap in silence for an hour, recharging his sanity before disappearing into the night to rule his kingdom. They barely spoke, yet the intimacy of the silence was growing, knitting them together against her will. But she couldn't hide forever. The day of the introduction tea arrived. It was Lady Vespera's idea, a formal gathering in the hanging gardens to welcome the future queen. Lucius had forbidden it, but the council overruled him, citing ancient laws that the intended bride must be presented to the high families. Lucius was furious. He couldn't attend. Tradition forbade the groom from the first viewing. "Stay close to the guards," Lucius told her that morning, gripping her shoulders. "Do not eat anything. Do not drink anything unless you see them pour it from a sealed bottle, and do not let them see you bleed." Celestia wore a gown of pale gold, chosen to hide the dustwalker gray of her past. But as she walked into the garden, she felt like an imposter. The garden was breathtaking, filled with floating lilies and singing crystals. The high-born ladies of the Wolf Court sat at white iron tables, sipping nectar. When Celestia entered, the conversation died instantly. Lady Vespera sat at the head table, looking like a poisonous flower in crimson silk. "Ah," Vespera purred, standing up, "the miracle." She looked Celestia up and down with a sneer. "You clean up well for a floor scrubber, though I suppose one can paint dirt gold, it remains dirt underneath." The ladies tittered behind their fans. Celestia kept her head high, remembering Lucius's command, "You are the anchor." "I may be dirt, Lady Vespera," Celestia said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "But the earth supports the mountains. Without the dirt, the throne has nowhere to stand." The silence that followed was stunned. Servants didn't speak back. Vespera's eyes narrowed into slits. "Clever, but let us see if you have the grace to match the tongue." She clapped her hands. "Bring the gift." 2 servants brought forward a covered cage. Vespera smiled, a cruel, predatory thing. "In our tradition, the future queen must demonstrate her affinity with nature. This is a moon adder. It is deadly, but it only bites those with impure intentions, or those who are weak." She pulled the cover off. Inside, a serpent made of iridescent black scales hissed, its fangs dripping green venom. "Stick your hand in, dear," Vespera challenged. "Prove you are worthy of the king." Celestia froze. This was a trap. If she refused, she was weak. If she did it, she died. "The king protects me," Celestia said, backing away. "I do not need to prove anything to you." "The king isn't here," Vespera hissed. She flicked her wrist, murmuring a spell. The cage door sprang open. The moon adder didn't slither. It launched itself through the air, straight for Celestia's throat. Celestia screamed, throwing her hands up, but the bite never came. Mid-air, the snake hit an invisible wall. It bounced off a shimmering golden barrier that erupted from Celestia's skin, the soul bond reacting to the threat. The snake fell to the grass, writhing. Suddenly, the snake stopped hissing. It looked at Celestia, tasted the air, and then bowed. It coiled submissively at her feet. The court gasped. Animals only bowed to alphas. "She has no scent," one duchess whispered. "Why does the beast obey her?" Vespera turned pale. "Sorcery! She is using dark magic!" "Enough!" The garden gates exploded inward. Lucius stood there, his sword drawn, surrounded by a dozen royal guards. He had felt her fear through the bond. He crossed the distance in a blur of motion, grabbing Vespera by the throat and lifting her off the ground. "I told you," Lucius roared, his voice shaking the trees, "not to touch her." "Lucius, stop!" Celestia yelled, grabbing his arm. The violet fire was consuming him again. He was going to kill Vespera in front of the entire court. That would start a civil war. "Don't! The bond! Look at the bond!" Lucius froze. He looked down at Celestia's hand on his arm. The golden light was pulsing frantically, fighting the violet darkness. He dropped Vespera. She collapsed, gasping for air, clutching her bruised neck. "Get out!" Lucius snarled at the court. "Everyone, get out!" As the terrifying nobles fled, Lucius turned to Celestia. He didn't check if she was hurt. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking uncontrollably. "I felt you die," he whispered brokenly. "For a second, I felt the bond snap. I thought I lost you." "I'm here," Celestia soothed, stroking the back of his neck, realizing with a start that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid for him. "I'm here." The attack in the garden changed everything. The wedding was moved up. It was to take place tomorrow night, under the zenith of the blood moon. The palace was in lockdown. But the danger wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside Lucius. The incident with Vespera had triggered something. The void magic was fighting back against the bond harder than ever. Lucius was burning up. It was midnight. Celestia was in her room, pacing. She couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, charged with static. Her door opened. Lucius stumbled in. He looked worse than the first night she met him. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, his skin gray. The violet veins had spread up his jawline, cracking his skin like porcelain. "Lucius!" Celestia ran to him. He collapsed into her arms, his weight dragging them both to the floor. "It's not working," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "Being near you, it's not enough anymore. The moon, it amplifies the curse." "What do I do?" Celestia cried, cradling his head. "Tell me what to do." Lucius looked up at her. His eyes were almost entirely black now. "The bond, it has to be sealed. Physically, spiritually, completely." Celestia's breath hitched. She knew what he meant. "But you're dying," she whispered. "If I take you now," he groaned, rolling away from her as if afraid he would hurt her, "I might kill you. The energy transfer. It would be too much for a human. For a null." "I'm not just a null," Celestia said, a sudden clarity washing over her. She remembered the snake bowing. She remembered the barrier. "I stopped the snake. It didn't bite me. Lucius, maybe I'm strong enough." "No," he snarled, clawing at the rug. "I won't risk it. I'd rather die." "If you die, I die," Celestia shouted. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "We are bound, Lucius. If the void takes you, it takes me too. Let me save you." She kissed him. It was the first time their lips had touched. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was a collision of matter and antimatter. Gold and violet light exploded in the room, shattering the windows. The power surged between them, hot, overwhelming, and terrifying. Celestia felt like she was being unmade, her very soul stripped bare and woven into his. Lucius groaned, a sound of pure relief and agony, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her closer, deepening the connection. The madness in him began to recede, retreating before the blinding light of her soul. But just as the bond began to settle, just as the healing began, the door was blown off its hinges with a deafening boom. Smoke filled the room. Lucius roared, shielding Celestia with his body, but a canister rolled across the floor, hissing green gas, wolfsbane vapor, concentrated. Lucius coughed, his strength sapped instantly. The gas paralyzed Alpha's. He slumped over Celestia, his weight pinning her down. "Lucius!" she screamed. Figures in black masks emerged from the smoke. They weren't palace guards, they were mercenaries. "Get the girl!" a voice commanded. A voice Celestia recognized, Vespera. "No!" Lucius tried to rise, his eyes glowing, but a mercenary slammed a heavy iron collar around his neck. Runes flared on the metal, a suppression collar. Lucius screamed as the magic burned his skin, neutralizing his powers. Two men grabbed Celestia, dragging her out from under the paralyzed king. "Let him go!" Celestia fought, kicking and biting, but she was no match for trained soldiers. "Don't worry, my dear." Vespera stepped into the room wearing a gas mask. She looked down at the helpless king. "I won't kill him. I need a husband after all. Once you are gone or the bond is broken, he will be a beast. A beast needs a keeper. I will rule in his name while he rots in a cage." "Celestia!" Lucius's roar was a broken gurgling sound, tears of blood streaming down his face as he fought the paralysis. "I will kill you all. I will burn this world." "Take her to the Cliff of Silence," Vesper ordered. "Throw her into the sea." "Lucius!" Celestia screamed one last time as she was dragged into the dark corridor. The last thing she saw was the Alpha King, the strongest man in the world, reaching out for her, his fingers scraping uselessly against the stone floor as the violet darkness of the void finally, completely, swallowed his eyes. The wind at the Cliff of Silence did not howl, it screamed. It was a jagged tear in the coastline where the ocean battered the rocks 1,000 feet below, a place where the Wolf Kings executed traitors. Tonight, it was to be the grave of a maid who dared to love a monster. Celestia was dragged to the edge, her heels digging useless furrows into the wet earth. The mercenaries, their faces hidden by iron masks, held her over the precipice. The salt spray stung her eyes, mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. "Any last words, filth?" the captain sneered, his grip tightening on her arm. Celestia looked back at the distant spire of the obsidian palace, now shrouded in a green, unnatural mist, Vespera's poison. She closed her eyes and reached into the bond. It was faint, a fraying thread, but it was there. She could feel Lucius. He wasn't dead, but he was drowning in a sea of agony so deep it stole the breath from her lungs. "He will come for you," Celestia whispered, her voice trembling but her resolve steel. "Even from the grave, he will come for you." The captain laughed. "The king is a collar-wearing dog now. Goodbye, girl." He shoved her. Gravity claimed her instantly. The world tilted into a blur of gray sky and black rock. The wind tore at her clothes, deafening her. As she plummeted toward the churning white water, terror paralyzed her heart. This was it, the end of the story. But as the water rushed up to meet her, something ancient woke up in Celestia's blood. The bond on her wrist flared, not with the golden light of the king, but with a blinding, pure white radiance. It was the light of the morning star, the dawn that breaks the night. "You are not nothing," a voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't Lucius, it was older. "You are the vessel, you are the dawn." She didn't hit the water with a bone-shattering crash. Instead, the ocean seemed to rise up to catch her. The water turned solid, cradling her impact like a massive fluid hand. She gasped, lying on the surface of the heaving waves, completely dry, surrounded by a sphere of white light that pushed the storm back. She wasn't a null because she had no magic. She was a null because her magic was the void's natural enemy. Pure, unadulterated life. She was an omega of the first line, a bloodline thought extinct, the spirit walkers. The realization hit her with the force of the fall. She wasn't just Lucius's anchor, she was his battery. And right now, he was running on empty. "I have to go back," she screamed at the storm. The ocean responded. A massive wave rose beneath her, lifting her high into the air, depositing her gently onto the jagged rocks of the lower cove. Celestia scrambled up the wet stones, her gown torn, her hair wild, her eyes glowing with a terrifying new power. She found a narrow goat path winding up the cliff face. It would take hours to climb, and her hands would bleed, but she didn't care. Up above in the palace, the bond screamed again. Lucius was fading, the man was dying, and the beast was taking the throne. "Hold on," she gritted out, digging her fingers into the rock. "Just hold on." The obsidian palace had fallen silent. It was the silence of a graveyard. Lady Vespera sat on the throne, a goblet of wine in her hand, watching the magical projection of the dungeon. In the cell below, Lucius was chained to the wall with heavy runic shackles. He was unrecognizable. The suppression collar had been removed because it was no longer needed. His mind was gone. He was a creature of shadow and instinct, thrashing against the chains, howling a sound that made even the guards cover their ears. "Beautiful," Vespera murmured, "a weapon of mass destruction, and I hold the leash." But beneath the floorboards, in the labyrinth of service tunnels and laundry chutes, a different kind of power was stirring. Celestia had entered the palace not through the golden gates, but through the sewage drain in the scullery, the path of the lowest servants. She emerged in the laundry room, dripping wet, smelling of the sea and fury. Mara, the head housekeeper, dropped a basket of linens when she saw her. "Ghost!" Mara shrieked, backing away. "You're dead! They said you were dead!" "Not yet," Celestia said, wringing out her hair. She looked at Mara, her eyes burning with white fire. "Where is he?" Mara trembled. She had spent her life bowing to power, but the woman standing before her held a different kind of authority. It wasn't the authority of fear, it was the authority of truth. "The dungeon," Mara whispered. "Vespera, she's going to execute the council at dawn. She says the king has gone mad and she must rule as regent." "She's lying," Celestia said. "She drove him mad." Celestia grabbed a gray servant's cloak from a hook and threw it over her ruined gold dress. "Mara," Celestia said, her voice softening. "I need you. I can't fight the guards alone." "Me?" Mara scoffed, though her hands were shaking. "I'm just a housekeeper. We are just dust, girl." "Dust gets everywhere," Celestia replied, quoting the old servant's adage. "Dust clogs the gears, dust blinds the enemy, and if there is enough of it, dust can bury a mountain." She held out her hand. Mara looked at the hand, then at the door. She thought of the cruel whips of Vespera's guards. She thought of Lucius, who, despite his scary reputation, had never struck a servant without cause. Mara took Celestia's hand. "The kitchen staff have knives," Mara said, a grim smile touching her lips. "And the gardeners have scythes, and we know every secret door in this cursed castle." Within the hour, the invisible people of the palace went to war. It started subtly. Lights in the guard barracks were extinguished. Strange noises lured sentries into dead ends, where they were met with heavy skillets and sleeping drafts. The dustwalkers moved like shadows, clearing a path for their queen. Celestia moved through the chaos, focused on one thing: the heartbeat in the floor, the deep rhythmic thrum of the alpha. She reached the heavy iron door of the dungeon. 2 elite guards stood watch. Before they could draw their swords, a cloud of flour exploded in their faces, followed by the dull thud of rolling pins. The palace cook, a massive bear of a man, nodded to Celestia. "Go, child," he grunted. "We'll hold the line." Celestia pushed the door open and descended into the dark. The dungeon did not just smell of ozone and despair, it smelled of a soul being incinerated. The air grew heavier with every step Celestia took down the spiraling black stairs. The stone walls here were slick with condensation, weeping as if the castle itself were in mourning. A low, guttural vibration hummed through the floorboards, a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a scream. It was the sound of a mind fracturing. Celestia reached the bottom landing. The dungeon was a vast, circular chamber carved from the bedrock of the mountain. In the center, illuminated by a single flickering torch, was a scene from a nightmare. Lucius was on his knees. He was stripped to the waist, his skin a canvas of throbbing violet veins that pulsed like dying stars. Massive chains of dark iron, etched with glowing red runes, bound his wrists and ankles to the floor. But the chains weren't just holding him, they were feeding off him. Every time he pulled, the runes flared brighter, drinking his essence. The shadows around him were alive. They writhed and snapped like starving wolves, manifestations of the void magic that had completely consumed his consciousness. "Lucius," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The creature that had been the king snapped its head up. Celestia gasped, stumbling back a step. There was no humanity left in that face. His eyes were entirely black voids, 2 pools of infinite darkness that swallowed the torchlight. His mouth was pulled back in a rictus of snarling rage, his teeth bared and lengthened. He didn't look at her with recognition. He looked at her with the predatory focus of a beast spotting fresh meat. He lunged. The chains snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot, the metal groaning under the strain of his supernatural strength. He roared, a sound so loud it vibrated in her bones and blew out the torch, plunging them into near darkness. "It's me," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. She stepped into the circle of dim light cast by the glowing runes. "It's Celestia." He swiped at her, his claws slicing the air inches from her face. The void energy lashed out like a whip, cutting a thin line across her cheek. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to be afraid. Fear was what the void fed on. Touching, really, like a moth flying into a blast furnace. The slow, mocking clap echoed from the shadows behind the pillars. Lady Vespera stepped into the light, flanked by a dozen elite mercenaries, armed with heavy crossbows leveled at Celestia's heart. "The rat crawled back from the ocean," Vespera sneered, smoothing the silk of her crimson gown. "I must fire those incompetents on the cliff. But no matter. Fate has delivered you just in time to see your boyfriend become my permanent pet." She held up a jagged crystal that pulsed with a sickly crimson light. "This creates a feedback loop in his mind. Pain becomes obedience. One word from me, and his brain melts. Another word, and he rips you to shreds." "He isn't a pet," Celestia said, her voice echoing strangely in the stone room. A soft, white light began to leak from her skin, illuminating the damp walls and making the shadows recoil. "And you have no idea what you've awakened." "I awakened a god of destruction," Vespera laughed, her eyes glinting with madness. "And now I will point him at my enemies, starting with you." She squeezed the crystal. "Kill her." Lucius convulsed, throwing his head back in a scream that sounded like tearing metal. The red magic forced his muscles to move against his will. He pivoted on his knees, his body a puppet of Vespera's torture. With a sickening crack of stone, he ripped the iron staple of his right chain out of the floor. He turned toward Celestia, dragging the heavy chain like a flail. He raised his clawed hand to strike, the void gathering in his palm like a miniature black hole. "Do it!" Vespera shrieked. The mercenaries tensed their fingers on the triggers. Celestia didn't run. She didn't fight. She knew that fighting darkness with darkness only created more shadows. She did the only thing that could bridge the gap between the monster and the man. She dropped her gray cloak. She stood before him in the tattered remains of her golden gown, defenseless, open, radiating pure, blinding acceptance. She looked past the black void of his eyes, searching for the speck of gold she knew was buried deep within. "I need you," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the void, clear as a bell. Lucius's hand froze mid-air, trembling violently. The blackness in his eyes flickered, a war raging behind them. "I need to make love," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She repeated the words he had said to her that first night in the study, not as a plea for sex, but as a desperate invocation of their bond, a plea for the ultimate connection of souls that could anchor him back to reality. To break the fever, to come home. She stepped forward, closing the distance. The void energy crackled against her skin, burning, but she ignored it. She pressed her chest against his heaving, scarred torso. She took his raised, clawed hand and forcibly placed it over her heart. "Don't move," she commanded softly, her eyes locking onto his. The shockwave was instantaneous. When her skin touched his, it wasn't just a spark, it was a supernova. The white light of the dawn crashed into the violet darkness of the void. Lucius gasped, his back arching as if he'd been electrocuted. The impact of her soul hitting his was physical. The blackness was ripped from his eyes like a veil being torn away by a hurricane. The red magic of Vespera's crystal shattered, unable to exist in the presence of such absolute purity. "No!" Vespera screamed as the crystal in her hand disintegrated, burning her palm. The energy exploded outward in a blinding ring. The mercenaries were thrown against the walls like rag dolls, their crossbows clattering uselessly to the floor. The stone pillars cracked. The iron chains binding Lucius melted into slag, dripping onto the stones. In the center of the storm, Lucius and Celestia stood locked together, untouched by the destruction around them. The madness drained out of him, siphoned away by the white light, replaced by the warm, grounding gold of the bond. He blinked, the golden irises returning, bright, clear, and horrified. He looked down at the woman in his arms. He saw the cut on her cheek. He saw the bruises on her arms. He felt the terrifying strength of the power she had just poured into him. "Celestia!" he choked out, his voice rough but undeniably human. "I got you," she sobbed, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline crashed. Lucius caught her before she hit the ground, scooping her up effortlessly against his chest. He looked at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. But then he looked up. His eyes landed on Vespera, who was scrambling backward through the debris, clutching her burned hand. The tenderness vanished from Lucius's face instantly, replaced by the cold, terrifying wrath of a king who had just been woken from a nightmare. "You," he growled. The word was soft, but it carried more weight than his roar had. Vespera hit the wall, nowhere left to run. "Lucius, wait! I was trying to save you. She bewitched you. I am your equal." Lucius stepped forward, stepping over the unconscious bodies of her mercenaries. The shadows in the room gathered around him again, but this time, they didn't bite. They bowed. He was the master of the void now, not its slave. "You are not my equal," Lucius said, his voice devoid of pity. "You tried to break my anchor. You tried to drown the only part of my soul that matters." He raised a hand. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Vespera's ankles like snakes. "Please!" she begged, sinking to the floor. "I will not kill you," Lucius said coldly. "Death is too quick for a traitor who poisoned her king." He pointed to the door. "Leave. If the sun sets on you within the borders of the wolf kingdom, the shadows will eat you alive. Run, Vespera. Run while you still have legs." Vespera didn't wait. She scrambled up, her crimson dress torn, her dignity in tatters, and fled into the darkness, the sound of her sobbing echoing up the stairs. Lucius turned back to Celestia. The rage evaporated the moment he looked at her. He fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. He wept, great heaving sobs of a man who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by a miracle. "I thought you were gone," he whispered into the fabric of her ruined dress. "I felt you fall. I was ready to burn the world to ash just to make a pyre for you." Celestia stroked his hair, the golden bond on their wrists shining steadily, a beacon in the dark. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, lifting his chin so she could kiss him, a gentle, sealing promise. "We are the balance, Lucius, the night and the dawn. One cannot exist without the other." The wedding of King Lucius Nightshade and Celestia Dawn was not held in the great hall. It was held in the courtyard with the gates thrown wide open. Nobles stood shoulder to shoulder with scullery maids, gardeners, and stable boys. Celestia didn't wear a crown of diamonds. She wore a wreath of moonflowers. When Lucius kissed her, the sky above turned a twilight purple, streaked with the gold of the rising sun, a promise of a new era. They ruled not with fear, but with a terrifying absolute justice. The void curse was never fully cured, but it was managed, held in check by the Omega, who was strong enough to hold the night in her arms. Legend says that if you walk by the obsidian palace at night, you can sometimes see them on the balcony. The dark king and his glowing queen, standing close, his head resting on her shoulder, proof that even the darkest monsters can be saved by the light of a single brave heart. Moral of the story: true power isn't about dominance or strength. It's about finding the one person who makes you whole and having the courage to let them save you. Love is the only magic that can turn a beast back into a man. If you enjoyed this story of dark romance and destiny, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of love that defies the odds.